So while we are all getting seated, reorganized, or still getting coffees, a very good morning. Thank you for joining us on the topic of digital identity. One might wonder, why are we talking about this at DLD? Like, how's that relevant? How's that relevant to me on a Friday morning, and what would I need to know? Look, the topic of digital identity is a fascinating one, and you'll hear all about the relevance right now, where Ralph can actually explain to us what digital identity in the context of 8 billion people now on the planet, where I saw also you wrote a really thoughtful piece about it. Like, what is the realm in which we need to think about this before we get into it, what it actually is?
Yeah, well, thank you for the opening question, and good morning to all of you. I learned that there was a little party last night, right?
Yes.
So I hope you're all here and there. And but talking about identities, I think what we have to recognize that there are 8 billion people on this planet, that over 1 billion has no identity at all. So there is no proof of existence.
1 billion people?
1 billion people. There's no proof of existence of these people. So they cannot participate in very basic things. Banking, financial system, education, which is very important, but even, let's say, important things like elections, because how can you prove your existence? You cannot elect them. So, and this is something of the basics we have to get done. Before we talk about digital identities, I think the basic thing is that everybody has an identity at all in order to participate in life somehow.
Oh, absolutely. This billion people number I find staggering.
Yeah.
I mean,
because we have a luxury problem, right? We cannot access here without proving our identity somehow, with a document or something, and we had to register before. So we talk about a two-world thing, right? The one world is get identities for people overall, and the second thing is how do we master identities in the digital world, right? So that it's two things.
Very clear. No, it's a big challenge. So what could we do if we had that for those 8 billion people, or even for the ones like that might be actually closer to achieving that already? Because I understand there's different stepping stones depending on where you are. What's the, let's say, most visionary or relevant aspirations you might have in that field? Bring it to life a little bit.
Well, let's put it this way. From getting the basics done, getting identities for people, and following the UN goal of getting identities for everyone, the other extreme is, I was in Singapore very recently, and I was very impressed with the SingPass, which is an application from the Singaporean government, where you once go to register, give your original ID documents, register to the app, and then you can do many, many things, from KYC processes for opening bank accounts, to managing your health, your doctor's visits and all the stuff, and other things. And that is probably the most advanced system on the country. So from countries with no identities to states like Singapore who have a very advanced system where you can practically manage your life with proving original ID in the digital world. So that's a very extreme span.
Quite a spectrum.
Yeah, quite a spectrum.
So beyond now here in Europe, where are we at with our passports, having identities, aspiring to be a bit more digital as a continent? Where are we at?
Yeah, I think Europe is a little bit like a patchwork, right? We have a lot of countries, we have 450 million people, and the patchwork is very extreme because every country has their own identity system. And at the same time, there is a North Star of having a regulation which allows every country and every citizen to participate in a digital ID scheme. And I think that North Star is very important because otherwise we cannot get rid of that patchwork, and otherwise we cannot master the advanced system of all the web applications here in Europe, because everybody has multiple identities in different schemes. But there is no official, let's say, official identity which is underlying here so that you can control your data and all the transactions you do in the web.
So what would it take for us to get there?
Well, I think from a North Star to where we are today, probably there are some steps in between, right? I think from the regulation part, that is the first thing. I think there is a lot of critics coming from the regulation part that there's still a lot of security issues.
Explain to us a little where we're at even in terms of regulations. So what's even the baseline and where do you want to go?
Good point. I think the baseline is that we have a regulation coming from the EU that by 2030, 80% of European citizens, so 80% from 450 million people, in the EU should have access to a digital ID scheme, where you can practically do what SingPass is already doing today. So we are 10 years behind, practically speaking.
And it's an interesting distinction too, because I heard you say should have access to a digital ID system, not should have a digital ID.
Yeah, well, the prerequisite that you have one.
That is true, but it's like a step further than
it's a step
Europeans having.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we want to be in 2030 where Singapore is today, so that you can have your health data, that you can have your bank account opening, that you can do many things, many applications, which today you do in a very fragmented web space. So that is the idea of the North Star. So getting there means that you must have a technical system and somebody who's handling and managing that system. And with 450 million people is a little different than managing it in Singapore with 5 or 6 million people. So that's where we are. And we are in the middle of that road. And currently there's a lot of technical concepts being evaluated.
Yeah.
So the pro is it's underway. Yeah. The risk is, as always in Europe, that the North Star is very big. It's a very big system. We have a lot of countries, a lot of different jurisdictions that we get lost in space in the meantime.
Well, I can imagine it sounds very complex. Regulatory, then the member states, and also like technology. What would, you talked about steps or stepping stones, what would real unlocks be? Like how can we leap as opposed to step in that process? Because you said we're behind, right?
I'd like to take a very different example. I would like to take a country which is not so popular at the moment, China, and how they approach their digital currency. China started very early in testing out technologies, and they made different tests, and they made pilots, and they tested it with the large tech companies, because you need to involve them, because they have the inroads to customers, to the users, to the citizens in the end, right? And by testing it in different cities at smaller and larger scale pilots, they were figuring out what the system in the end should be. And I think that is probably a milestone plan for Europe. Instead of having a super big rollout, you go in small steps, you test it out, you have technology stacks, and then you go step by step. And I think that is probably a better path for Europe as opposed to a big bang or to finding the ultimate technical solution. It is a gradual approach. Typically like in platform businesses.
That is interesting, as you say that with the different countries, right? So it's like, how do they cooperate, you think? It's like, what would be forms, because China, one jurisdiction, probably a bit easier on data protection also than we would take this here in Europe. So
it's interesting how Singapore did that. Singapore started with a very open platform and with no data protection regulations at all. Now that it runs, they move back. They delete data, for example, if they're not used anymore. So they actually started it, and now they incorporate other things. In Europe, we would probably do it the other way around, right? Because data protection concerns are very high here, and data privacy things as well.
It's probably also a trust question, no, on the citizens' part. So it's like, how would I trust, like, to actually create a full digital identity? What's like the misuse that might possibly happen? So how is the whole trust beyond, let's say, the technological bar? How is that trust thing addressed with citizens so they actually take it up?
I think probably it's in all our experience. I think there's two things. The one thing is that convenience is very high, and the big tech companies showed us how convenient it can work. They made it super easy to make payment transactions in 3 or 4 steps, and by using your, let's say, identity you have given to them. And they use your data. And at the same time, there's the other philosophy of, let's say, next to convenience, having security. Both in combination eventually create also trust. The only thing where there's a difference to payments is, in payment you have limited liabilities. For your personal data, I think there's nobody who give you limited liability. You give it away, and if it's gone, it's gone.
So what questions do you most get in terms of like uptake and unlocks? Like what's the stuff that keeps you up at night on these topics?
That's a difficult question, I must say, because I think from you see in Singapore that it can be done easily. If the state wants, if the citizens accept that, and if the system somehow is convenient and secure at the same time. And if the government sticks to their promise that they not misuse it somehow, right? There's always that thing over there. So
many ifs are here.
And in a very large environment like Europe, it's very complicated to do. So therefore, small steps, small pilots really help to create confidence.
Tell me about the role you just mentioned, like the convenience and what people expect. About the role of all of the digital conglomerates we already entrust our data to. So what's the role of the Apples and the Amazons in this world, and maybe being part of bringing that to life or not in a competitive way? What's they're
all part of our life because we all have enrolled to them, to the Googles, to the Amazons, to Apple. So we have our single sign-on schemes. If you want to go for a system as Europe envisioned it, the concept behind it is called self-sovereign identity. That means that you have self-control over where you give your identity and how you manage that. That means that large tech companies have to cooperate and open their schemes to that self-sovereign identity system. So technically there must be a combination and an opening. If they stick to their schemes, we are bound to having multiple identities. If we don't like their scheme, we have to open up for every new service. So, and the self-sovereign identity concept, which Europe envisaged, at least allows that you have one scheme for your identity and you can enroll to multiple services. Government services, travel services, whatever.
Do you think that is understood by citizens, both the potential you've sketched out, but then also where we're currently at this point?
I think it's very complicated, but the big tech companies understand it very, very well because it's part of their value story to have that proprietary system, and if they open it, they maybe lose value. That's their fear. But I think making it clear to all citizens is almost impossible. The only message you can give is you regain the control over your transactions and over your data and over your identity. There must be a very strong value story behind.
Yes, very strong value story. And I think that's, in essence, what would get people to move, right? And maybe also explaining what you've actually already given away. Because I think maybe the distance is not that far from actually is already, let's say, dislocated in multiple occasions. Probably there's a bit of a translation also to be done to the general public to take this up.
I guess so.
What would be your vision? So if we were to get together at DLD again in 3 years, where would we be at as Europeans in digital identity? What do you think we should have achieved?
I think
as you talked about steps so much. And
the dream would be, let's say, for example, that we have in Germany or in some other countries test beds where we test out with a number of citizens these kind of digital IDs, where they have really enrollment possibilities, that we have a scheme, that we have the technical capabilities, and that we are able to test it out. And then to prove it to the public that it works out. That would be a very good milestone in between to 2030, where 80% of the people should have that. That would be a nice area. But I think the vision overall for the world is twofold. I think we still have to get the basics done. The basics is for the people who have no identity at all, so they must have basic identity systems so that they can prove their existence and have access to life. And for the, let's say, more developed digital world, we must have a different scheme with a self-sovereign, with a self-controlled identity system, which we envision here. So that twofold objective remains, I believe.
And two-speed architecture, of course, you have to, otherwise you can't move these. How would they, who would be thinking through how these can eventually, we're talking about human progress and the world converging, how would these eventually be brought together? Is there a global community where yourself and others participate and you think about how global identities evolve? Or who architects this for us? Because it sounds like a global thing we need to bring together, no?
I think how global architecture works, we see at the moment, states don't cooperate very well. But I guess if we do the basics in the countries who need development, and if we have basic schemes for identity, and if we also have something in combination, digital currencies, then it will be very easy for people to get access also to the financial world, even without bank accounts. So if you can prove an identity, and you have a mobile phone, and you have a digital currency scheme, you can easier access to the digital world. So that will be an automatic convergence in countries which have developing aspects. And in our world, I think we simply have to get the other basics done, that we have digital identity schemes which work.
It's interesting when you say that, because it almost sounds like some countries who are not as, let's say, like structured as probably like other countries are, might be able to leapfrog as well on that front. No, it's like when you're faster to introduce a digital currency, maybe you have a better or higher incentive also to suddenly get enrolled on the identity side because it's just natural. No, there's more, I would imagine.
If you take, let's say, not so developed countries, I think it should be in their interest to have identities, because if people can participate in life and to the financial systems, they eventually can pay tax. Because that's typically poor countries, and they can develop a spiral up in economic development. So identities and access to the financial system is a basic to that. So that helps, practically speaking. And for us, it helps to keep our dynamic in the digital world when we have safe and self-sovereign identities.
It's a fascinating space. I mean, we could talk about so many things. I have one more angle I would love to take before I think we're out of time. Digital identity, as the world is increasingly moving online, also in communication. I don't mean Zoom. I mean, it's like the role of the metaverse and the social platforms and like the bots trying to influence elections. So what's your take on this? Could a validated digital identity actually reintroduce maybe some truth or civilization if real people would actually be real people then also online, or is that too controversial to
that's a super space. But my take on the metaverse, at least those with the glasses and where you sit on the sofa and eat potato chips and go to the digital gym, I don't buy that somehow. But I envisage an industrial metaverse. Right? An industrial metaverse where things are connected and where things have different identities, where, like in IoT, cars have an identity, and when you go to the petrol station, it pays automatically with the car identity. I think those systems,
things as well, not just
things have identities too.
Okay.
And I think that's a vision forward for our society, that with people having identities, things can have identities, and how we connect that. And that would be a nice vision forward also to fuel our industrial space again.
The industrial side is entirely with you. I think that is absolutely true. And I think also things would probably object less in terms of having their identity somewhere stored and coded. The humans though, on like how do we bring like real, like when everything blurs and people have 50 identities and manipulation, who says what, the quality and respect also in communication and in the virtual world, I would think that if people were real people, so with clear names, like something attached to you, you would probably not say what you would say, or there's like less of you than you actually are. So civilization, transparency, I would see big hopes for this in the online world, no?
But I think a digital identity will not help to have eventually a new phase of enlightenment to all of us here with all the information we are getting, even if it's wrong or right information. So I think in the end we must stay critical when it comes to information. And the digital identity is only a tool in order to master our own data and to control our own data.
I can see that. Are you in exchange? Like, is that like, are there like uproars on like what do like data protectionists say? What are the biggest critics of this?
On the European space, that's the biggest critic, right? It's data privacy, data protection is one of the biggest issues in the digital identity space, because, as I said, there's no limited liability on your private data. In payment transaction there is, but not for private data.
We talked about so much. It's a fascinating topic. I will quiz you over a coffee right now, but so far, thank you so much for coming on stage and sharing this very complex and very fascinating space here in on digital identities. Thank you so much, Ralph.
Thank you.